The wiry proto-punk grooves of Devo have always kind of befuddled me, so I thought I'd give them a serious listen to see if I can work out what it's all about. This band made their name by pairing an angular mechanised music with sly social critique. Their talent for ironic sideward glances are certainly welcome, especially in the over-censorious age we find ourselves in. To me, their voice sounded like an edgier Talking Heads. You know, George Bernard Shaw said, life is about creating yourself, and my word, they certainly did that. In fact, their curious name Devo was a shortening of devolution, or de-evolution in fact. The band's own theory that turned Darwinism on its head and pitched mankind in inexorable decline, relentlessly moving backwards to the condition of apes. And this worldview is part of the very fabric of this band's extended universe, with their music utilising analogue synths, dressing uniformly, looking like a more demented Kraftwerk. Their music, an angular sardonic funk rock that mixed yelping vocals, aggressive rhythms, and Frank Zappa-like social satire and science fiction kitsch. The songwriting exploring dark themes set to an emotionless clatter of music as they present themselves as these ironic proto-punk automatons. It's a complex and sometimes baffling body of work.
I don't think we were even supposed to be a rock band. We thought of ourselves as like an Akron, Ohio version of Andy Warhol's Factory, only with more important message.
Led by the myopic Mothersbaugh and fellow Kent State University students Sir Jerry Casale and Bob Lewis, Devo had been active to various degrees since 1972, releasing garage-recorded singles on their very own label, the Misspelt Boogie Boy. But what it evolved into was much more intriguing. This band is a seminal touchstone in the development of American New Wave. The band's use of synthesizers are an important textural element to their sound, although they do tend to play a more supporting role here, as Devo knock out these terse, nervy singles that redefine rock and roll as an emotionless shudder, even in terms of their visual presentation, with Mark Mothersbaugh dressing as Boogie Boy, which consisted of a blonde rubber baby head. This band, with its use of character and its irreverent take on the canon of rock and roll, makes me think of them as perhaps devotees of those early Frank Zappa records. They were art school students who were radicalised by the May the 4th, 1970 shooting of the student protesters at Kent State University, where core members Gerald Casale and Mark Mothersbaugh were witnesses to the massacre, an event immortalised by the Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young number, Ohio.
Tin soldiers and Nixon's coming, we're finally on our own.
Their first performance was at Kent State's Creative Arts Festival in April 1973. The electronic gadgetry that defines the sound of the band were often instruments modified by Jim Mothersbaugh, who went on to work for Roland. Their experimental and dissonant art punk sound was certainly distinctive. Jocko Homo, the source of the group's famous call and response chant, "Are we not men? We are Devo." A refrain lifted from a chant in Earl C. Kenton's 1933 movie The Island of Lost Souls.
Not men! Not bees! Fart man!
And then we get Secret Agent Man. This was a cover of the 1966 hit by Johnny Rivers. However, it was their performance on Saturday Night Live, looking like an avant-garde sideshow, which was arguably a defining moment for this group. And let's not forget to mention the film In the Beginning Was the End, the truth about de-evolution, produced by director Chuck Statler. Apparently Neil Young was a huge fan, and the band of course would go on to feature in Neil Young's own Human Highway. Question, Are We Not Men? Answer, We Are Devo was their debut album released in 1978 on Warner Brothers, if I'm not mistaken. This is the album that's made the biggest impression upon me, with its dissonant, bony melodies, odd-numbered time signatures and yelping sing-song vocals. The tension builds yet never finds release. This music, there's no catharsis whatsoever, which is probably the point. Interestingly, Tom Carson, writing in Rolling Stone, claimed that There's not an ounce of feeling anywhere. Devo lacks most of Eno's warmth and much of Bowie's flair for mechanised melodrama. For all its idiosyncrasies, the music here is utterly impersonal. Mothersbaugh had made contact with Bowie when the Station to Station tour swung through Ohio in early 1976. And in interviews, he had modestly declared that the only names the band would entertain as producers for their unrecorded debut album were Bowie and Eno. Iggy Pop had let it be known that he wanted to produce Devo's debut album. Earlier in the summer, both Bowie and Eno had been in New York, the latter staying with Robert Fripp, who, having returned to music as guitar player on Peter Gabriel's 1976 debut album, was kind of touting himself around as a session musician. Fripp and Bowie were in the audience on the evening of the 25th of May when Devo played 2 sold-out sets at Max's Kansas City. Bowie even took to the stage to introduce the band's second set. "This is the band of the future. I'm going to produce them in Tokyo this winter." However, Bowie's impulsive pronouncement proved to be a bit hasty, as his schedule would prevent him from working with the band. Eno, of course, agreed to produce him at Connie Plank's studio near Cologne. To quote from David Shepard's book, Eno discreetly volunteered his services as producer, suggesting the band convene in Berlin as soon as Bowie's forthcoming sessions were completed. Eno had been seduced by the currently labelless Devo to such an extent that he proposed to take care of the recording, travel and accommodation expenses out of his own pocket. The band's debut album resembles the absurdist social satire of Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. Although Devo's sound was broader, I think that was the sensibility they were going for. There was also a lo-fi component to Devo's sound. In fact, Gerald Casalia said Devo has never sounded better when we were recording on 4-track. Their employment of Dadaist theories and their own critique of de-evolution, visually drawing from the vernacular of trashy American culture, all contributed to sort of portraying a mindset in decline, and a mindset that was submissive, which leads us back to Frank Zappa territory once more. Let's not forget Zappa described his own debut album as mostly satirical. Devo's music represented an unsettling, nervy critique of the world around them. There was an almost unbearable tension in the rather jerky, discomforting rhythms they employed. Interesting bedfellows along with bands like XTC and Talking Heads, and other similarly sort of nervy new wavers. Devo knocked out a handful of terse, juddery singles that refined rock and roll to its brutalist essence. Devo used cover songs to illustrate the gulf between themselves and conventional rock bands. Where the rock gods of the 1970s revelled in abandon, they specialised in rhythms so tightly wound they seemed disturbingly mechanical. Their version of I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which strips away Keith Richards' signature fuzz-tone riff, and instead wraps up tension with guitars scratching along to a clockwork beat, effectively removing its lustful pout in favour of a kind of an emotionless rattle. Devo seemed to translate all our cultural cliches and fed them back to us in a lurid and postmodern appropriation. Their appearance on Saturday Night Live in 1978 was something else. They seemed different to anything that surrounded them. Their regimented concerts were an interesting juxtaposition to the anarchic spontaneity of punk, and let's not forget the conformity of their uniforms, especially after they introduced their matching Energy Dome hats. It could be argued that Devo are more eccentric than revolutionary. This is especially true of the music they made after 1980's Freedom of Choice. The album that Mark Mothersbaugh claimed was the end of Devo. The second album was produced by Ken Scott, which moved away from those experimental nuances brought by Eno on the first record. Freedom of Choice is often hailed as the band's masterpiece and is far more electronic. And we see a morphing from a punk sound to a new wave sound with this album. Gates of Steel is a great tune, as well as Whip It, we all know that one, which catapulted this band to stardom, maybe eventually enabling them to become everything that they'd satirised prior. There's no doubt that this band's sound and process changed. In fact, Stephen Thomas Erlewine states, instead of workshopping material in group rehearsals, Mothersbaugh built songs on his synthesizers. The stiff-clipped drum machines and plasticky keyboards crystallised on the clanging din of Shout, the title track to a 1984 album beaten into submission by a Fairlight synthesizer, were in a sense a logical progression from Devo's mechanical rock and roll. Yet the airless arrangements made it seem as if the band were succumbing to the very things they once satirised. I must admit I've been enjoying this band's music recently. I was never previously sure what I should make of them. I've been playing the recent compilation Devo at 50, feeling a bit bilious after all that Christmas fare. I figured this irreverent fizz was just the tonic. These Midwestern art rockers may have portended the future, but as Stephen Thomas Erlewine said in the article I've just quoted, in their hearts they were still driven by the same working class rhythms that fueled 20th century rock and roll. I know you've been watching a critique by Classic Album Review. If you've enjoyed it, please do click like, subscribe and check that notification bell. Well, that's that said. And I'll just leave you with my closing catchphrase, which is, as you know by now, hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.